vault with a swarm of black stars pushing themselves out and away. Onto a ram's silicified forehead, I brand this image between the horns, in which, in the song of the whorls, the marrow of melted hearts, oceans, swells. Into what does he not charge? The world is gone. I must carry you.
In Derrida's late seminar, The Beast and the Sovereign, the suggestion is made that ethics begins where the world ends, and conversely, that the end of the world marks the beginning of ethics. To help make this point, Derrida turns to a fragment taken from Paul Celan's poem, Vast Glowing Vault.
The world is gone. I must carry you.
By means of repetition, Derrida deploys this fragment to complicate and subvert Heidegger's theses on world that deprive stone and animal of a world. As with all poetry, Celan calls us to participation in a world existing somewhere between the semiotic and the explicit, and we enter into this world at the highest level of abstraction and velocity possible. The scale and vector from the outset is strikingly cosmic, as we experience a swarm of black stars rushing by. There is a feeling of chaos here, yet there is clear direction as well as we plunge almost immediately into a thick atmosphere, slowing our descent, and downward deeper still into a direct confrontation with the charging sacrificial ram in blood-drenched groves where pious men leap heavenward in their sacred rites. We pause here, asking why it is that the image of slaughter, of purification by means of bloodletting, always accompanies the exultant cry of man's making of the world that is at once his unmaking. But this inquiry only returns to us in the dead-eyed and open-mouthed silence of the slain ram. We follow the blood, burrowing into the earth, the dark riches of soil pouring in and around our bodies, blocking out every thinning ray of light, until at last we come to rest in the final line of the poem, where the world is gone. It is, in this very moment of the world's disappearance, in the darkness of morning, that you and I, and every other, come into full view. What remains when the world is gone is the face of those we must carry with us. Cast now within a receded and vaulted light, this face is radically changed, altered, transfigured into an infinite series of strange objects passing before us. The face of the other is hence the face of every other, including the face of the earth, over which a shadow now passes. Crockett's reading together of Derrida, Malibu, Deleuze, and Barad, among others, creates a singular relationship of differences, where several series interact to generate an altogether new intensive series. What might we say of this new identity, or of its dark precursor? Another way of asking this might be, what is the spirit of this text? As with our reading of Celan, were we to push our way past the letter, its technicity and apocalyptic implications toward the event it harbors, what remains when the world of the text is gone, if not a passion for life, the earth, its inhabitants, their continuance, and eventual disappearance? In this episode of the Catacombic Machine, Preston Price and I speak with the mighty Clayton Crockett. He's been on the show before, so you can go back and listen to that if you want. We talked about a few different things, but mainly ideas found in his book on Derrida that came out last November from Fordham University Press. It's a great text, and you'll find a link to it in the show notes. If you're at all interested in Derrida, you should definitely check it out. The conversation was a bit dense and theoretical, but enjoyable all the same. And at the end of the interview, there are a few off-the-cuff reflections Preston and I decided to just leave in there for kicks. All right, here's Clayton Crockett.
Oh, there he is. Clayton's on.
Okay. Yeah.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Good to see you.
Finally get to see you face to face.
Yeah.
How's your spring break going?
Spring break was last week. It was nice. I got a break, but then everything's just crazy. I was out in Northern California last weekend in Santa Rosa as part of the West Star. You know about this, the Jesus seminar, and they've got a new God seminar thing. Jeff and I and Caputo and others are involved in it. So.
Yeah, how'd that go?
It was good. We engaged with some decoloniality and some Native American spirituality stuff.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Devin was out there with you, right? Devin Singh?
Yeah, we brought Devin to give a talk and kind of engage him.
That's
we also had Anyente and Mary Keller that we talked to about some of the stuff. Yeah.
We're talking to Devin next month.
Okay, great. Yeah, his book is coming out. Currency.
In fact, there's some kind of online release party that I'm attending.
Yeah, again, thanks for coming on. So you wrote a book here, Derrida After the End of Writing, that came out last November, I think, right?
Right.
But before we get into that, I was wondering if you sent me an essay a couple of months back about Joy Division and kind of your deconversion. And I'm wondering, I really love Joy Division, and we actually use some of their graphics a little bit in our new Catacombic Machine logo. I don't know if you can see that, but could you talk a little bit about your love of Joy Division just briefly?
Yeah, sure. So that chapter was part of a book of essays on religion and popular music that Mike Grimshaw edited, and Songs of Fear and Trembling they came out with Palgrave Macmillan. And when he came over to the United States for the first time in Atlanta at the AR, I met and talked to him, and he ended up talking to a bunch of other people, including Bert Gerstenslager at Palgrave. And he developed and started this series on radical theologies. And so the book that Jeff and I wrote on religion, politics, and the earth was actually the first book in that series. So Grimshaw's been really, fantastic interlocutor. And then he and Cindy Zieher, Zieher, started this online journal in New Zealand called Continental Thought and Theory, which is really great. So what I was talking about was, just personally, I kind of got into alternative music at the end of high school, and not Joy Division, New Order was one of my favorite groups for a few years. And it was in college that I kind of realized that before there was New Order, there was Joy Division, and there was this guy, Ian Curtis, and he had killed himself, and there's this whole thing about that. And so I realized that, while New Order's music was kind of pessimistic, but it was really, had this great beat, and it was dancey and it was boppy and stuff like that. And I really enjoyed listening to it. Joy Division's music was even much more pessimistic, more nihilistic, more just depressing. And I really felt like I needed that. I needed to have that music with me, plus just aesthetically, musically. I mean, I don't know anything technically about music, but just listening to it, it just blew me away. And one of the things I've found, and as I talk to people, even recently after that book came out, is that, how much Joy Division's music still matters, and how much, pioneers they were, and how much some people that I know that are artists, that are musicians, keep coming back to Joy Division as a way to kind of, be inspired by the kinds of things that they did. And so that's really extraordinary to me.
Yeah, I think Henry Rollins recently on some show, I saw it on Facebook, he actually talked about Unknown Pleasures as being one of the best records ever. And you can always go back to that record and mine the gold that is there to kind of for inspiration, basically, to make music, and how great it was. That was actually, I was familiar with Joy Division, but when I read your essay that you sent me, I bought a couple of their albums, Closer, I'm not sure how you say that, and it had Closer, yeah. So I had that album plus some live songs, and then I bought Unknown Pleasures, and they're always in my rotation of records to listen to when I'm listening to my MP3 headphones and stuff. But so thank you again for that essay. I mean, Joy divisions, they're raw. They have such raw, like deep, profound emotions. I mean, just like the reference of the name of the band, right? Isn't that like a reference to the Joy Division from like the Nazis and kind of their whole?
Well, it's not a historical reference because we don't know if there were Joy Divisions in Nazism, but there was a novel that was based, that kind of fictionalized that. And so there may well have been those, but in this novel, it's a Jewish Hebrew name, talking about this, and that's where they get it. They get it from this novel. I can't think of a novel offhand.
Oh, okay.
We don't know for certain. There probably were groups like this, but we don't know exactly if there were, Joy Divisions per se, that were like, SS gangs or whatever groups that went around, women and, the flirtation with fascism, the ways in which in Britain, in Manchester, with the economy going down, and how that, had a certain fascination for some of the members of the group. I don't think Ian Curtis as much, but Bernard Sumner has talked about that. And then the ways in which, for other British bands, Pink Floyd talking about some of these themes, and then now thinking, today in terms of some of these fascist or proto-fascist elements. Yeah, it's interesting how when the economy goes down, some of these nationalist and even proto-fascist themes become attractive to folks.
Yeah, let's talk about Derrida a little bit. So it seems to me in the work you're doing quite a bit of stuff there, but like you want to not reinterpret, but like correct some of the linguistic idealism that a lot of the interpreters had of Derrida. So can you give us a little bit of a background of like where it is you're coming from in terms of interpreting Derrida and what it is you're trying to do just generally to start off the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I first read Derrida my senior year in college, and I took a course on linguistics. It's a linguistics course, language, meaning, and theory from the Bible to Derrida. And it just blew me away. And I read parts of grammatology, and I didn't understand it, but I kept kind of coming back to it. And throughout my graduate studies, kept reading Derrida. And my teacher, Charlie Winquist, got to be friends with Jack Caputo, and I got to know Caputo, talked to Caputo, and his book came out, The Prayers and Tears of Jacques Derrida, which in some ways was a sea change in terms of the American religious theological reception of Derrida, sort of beyond the typical postmodern theology of Charlie Winquist, Mark C. Taylor, Karl Raschke. And so then in the 21st century, you have all this speculative realism, object orientology, and even new materialism. And so there's this almost sense of, okay, well, Derrida was this kind of quasi-religious thinker, and, he's talking about language and writing, and it's this linguistic idealism and, subjectivism, and we need to get beyond that. And, Malibu is much more sophisticated, and so her reading engagement with Derrida than any of that. So I find her really, really powerful, but she's also challenged Derrida in many ways as well. So Malibu's idea, what she calls a motor scheme of plasticity in her book, Plasticity at the Dusk of Writing, is I use that to sort of think about and analyze and understand Derrida's later work, including this so-called turn, because there's so many Derridians and Derrida himself that resisted that idea of a turn, and yet it certainly seemed like there was something different. And so my argument, in the 90s and then into the 2000s. And so he's writing more directly about things with politics, and it seems to be a little bit detached from what Malibu calls writing as a motor schema or deep metaphor, or kind of the fundamental organizing principle of what it means to think. And so I don't think it's that Derrida himself changes his mind, but I think it's almost like that background, like context. There's something that's shifting and changing. And so what he's writing and what he's doing reads differently, without the presupposition of writing as a background. So obviously there's Derridians, from the beginning that accept, this is the writing schema, and then they keep reading Derrida's work in those contexts. And then there's others that engage him from different places and do different things. So I just take Malibu's idea, and I think it has some real purchase and some real, helpfulness for me. But I also use, it's not Derrida's language, but Arthur Bradley wrote a book on originary technicity and, Marx to Derrida. And so thinking about Derrida's later work and thinking about Derrida's terms of like technicity, the machinic teletechno science, And even in that great religion essay, there's the responsibility there, but then there's also this kind of machinic repetition. And he takes the thing from Bergson as a machine for making gods. So those themes seem to be not anchored in what we called writing from post-structuralism, postmodernism, even in a broad sense. I mean, it was never a narrow sense. It was always a very broad sense, but it seems like there's something that's a little bit different that's at stake. And even just the metaphor he uses of autoimmunity, which is a biological metaphor. Of course, Malibu's interested in biological materialism, right, is really fascinating if we pay attention to that. And so I use that as a kind of, let's think about kind of, broader transition, not on the surface of the text, but a little bit under the surface of the text that manifests in the text. And then when we look at the writings themselves, in terms of the later writings from what's it called? Think of the essay, I'm blanking on it right now, but the important one in 1989.
Is it Force of Law?
Yeah, Force of Law. So from Force of Law on to the end of his life, thinking about his engagement and his understanding and his work in terms of religion and politics as a kind of political theology without sovereignty. And so, he's trying to show a kind of deconstruction of sovereignty, mainly in Rogues, but then you also get that 2-volume lecture course at the end of his life, which are the first lecture courses that were published on the Beast and the Sovereign. And also, for me, seeing this almost as a running engagement and critique of Carl Schmitt. And so I think that Schmitt's significance, obviously he wrote The Politics of Friendship, and there's scattered references to Schmitt, but I think Schmitt's work, and it's been much clearer to many other people who study continental philosophy with Agamben and others, right, as being significant and important. But I think even for Derrida, it's important, even if Derrida is not talking about Schmitt. And so that gave me a kind of, again, helped me kind of read and reread some of Derrida's later work on religion and politics. He wouldn't use the word political theology because for him, political theology is Schmitt, right? Schmittian. Right. But I think we can kind of attend to those kinds of questions and issues of Derrida's work by thinking about it in those terms.
Yeah. The subtitle of the book is Political Theology and New Materialism, which I think may have, some people, they see Derrida and then they see these other words, like, maybe they're scratching their heads a little bit because, as you've said, Derrida is not typically thought of as explicitly doing a political theology or as a materialist. And I think you are pretty successful by way of these interventions with Malibu and these other people in helping us read Derrida better. But there's something also, like, if I can just say this, like something really intensely biographical in this work as well. I mean, not just in terms of your relationship to Derrida, which you write about, but you mentioned Charles Winquist, and he writes about how we have to begin from the middle of experience. And I thought it might be interesting to start by asking about the middle of this book, which is the chapter on Caputo. And I don't know, for me, I got the sense that this was really like the heart of the book in some ways. For me, there was an energy coming out of this chapter that I thought was palpable. And I was curious to hear what you think about that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you, Matt. I think that this is, for me, the most personal book that I've ever written. And that shows up most explicitly in the afterword, which I think also connects back to the middle of the book and the chapter on Caputo. And I mean, personally, Jack has been so generous and kind and good to me, even when I haven't always sort of seen things exactly the same things or wouldn't write about things in the same way. We just, this kind of deep respect and friendship that we've been able to have in this space that he's been kind of able to give me, partly as a student of Winquist, that he became close to Charlie before Charlie died. And then when Caputo came to Syracuse and took what was ultimately originally, before it had been Winquist's chair. And I joked that I sort of kind of forced him to adopt me along with Jeff Robbins, because we were kind of orphaned. Winquist is gone. He's our advisor. He's our mentor. And so then Caputo becomes this kind of, substitute for Winquist in a way. And then he carries on that work, which he'd already started, of bringing Derrida in a different way to these English-speaking audiences, bringing Derrida to Villanova, engaging him with these really powerful, profound religious questions. And so for Winquist, when I got to Syracuse, Charlie taught me to lose. And that's amazing. That's like unbelievable. And I couldn't fully understand it until like a decade later. I mean, not that I still understand Deleuze, but difference in repetition. We read that in seminar. I read Whitehead with him. I mean, just like such incredible stuff. But at the time, I was fascinated with Derrida, and I was reading the works that were being translated in the early 90s, and even a few of the French stuff, but mostly the translations. And I was like picking up on some of these themes, Aporia's, Spectres of Marx, eventually the religion essay. And Winquist was under the spell or the thrall of Mark C. Taylor, which so many people in religion and theology were, of like, Derrida's just, repeating himself and has nothing more to say, and that why should we waste our time with it? And so I remember arguing with Winquist about that. And then Caputo's book comes out, Prayers and Tears. And for me, at first, I didn't appreciate how important it was. I kind of underestimated it because it seemed so obvious to me. Like, because I was like, oh yeah, I've read those. I mean, that seems odd, but it wasn't clear to me how unobvious it was to everybody else, including Winquist, who wrote this, this short piece that he gave for a edited book of mine on secular theology, where it was part of that is from his, like he takes his engagement with and reading of Prayers and Tears. So there's a lot of personal stuff going on. And what I argue with Caputo, that Jack he sees something in Derrida where religion is about not writing, because theology is about writing for, Raschke, Winquist, Taylor, but is about a kind of faith and a kind of passion. And it's that passion that comes out in the Prayers and Tears that I think is so significant and Caputo is so attuned to. And even though he writes it in a more positive way, whereas Derrida is usually much more, ambivalent, right? Derrida wants to kind of hold on to both sides, and Caputo wants to kind of wager or push it over into a more affirmative side. But Jack understands Derrida. I mean, he knew Derrida, he understands Derrida, and it can be confusing for people who don't understand Derrida and don't understand what Caputo is doing with him. But I absolutely want to affirm everything that Caputo is doing, everything that he's trying to do, even though he gets misread by people, including Hagelin, as being too, baptizing Derrida on this kind of Christian faith. But that's not right. I mean, that's not what's really going on, I don't think. But using Caputo as a way to kind of transition and turn, and then Caputo's kind of affirmation engagement with radical theology explicitly, partly with Winquist, partly with me and Jeff, as a way to then open up into directly engaging Malibu, who provides so much of what, my reading of Derrida, and then eventually Barad. So yeah, it's really crucially important, significant. So.
Yeah, that connects with me on the idea of what I think you're doing in the afterword, which is looking at fathers, or like this lineage of fathers. Yeah. We can actually maybe even put like a capital F father, right? Because we're looking at like the father of philosophy and like kind of this phallogocentrism of the philosophical genealogy, right, of the discourse of men. But you brought in so many. You're critiquing that. Your relationship with your father, your relationship with like your substitute fathers, with Winquist and with Caputo, as you just said, kind of like your substitute father. But you're bringing in all these other feminist thinkers, Kathryn Keller, Kathryn Malibu, Karen Barad, all these other women, and I'm wondering. That was to kind of subtend or subvert this idea of like the philosophy as this male-dominated kind of, or not male-dominated, but this phallogocentric field. And I'm wondering, why was that important for you? I mean, it probably comes across in the text pretty well, but I'm wondering why was that like something that you thought was important to consider in this afterword on Derrida?
Yeah, so I mean, Derrida's written about women very much and very explicitly. And of course, he's also been critiqued by women, by feminists and others, for those writings. He's also been accused of being a womanizer, and there's certainly a lot of evidence for that in his biography. Derrida is one of these father figures for me, although more distant and less personally close than the other two. Although I met him and managed to talk to him briefly a couple times. But yeah, thinking through what Derrida talks about in relationship to the father. And what Derrida says, he says, I couldn't have a philosopher who's a mother. He says it in that Derrida film that was made. And so he says, maybe I could have like a daughter who could be, or a granddaughter, but not a mother. And so I'm kind of like, well, wait a minute, what's going on there? I mean, it's so fascinating because in some ways it's true about the patriarchal sexism of philosophy, which is also everything. It's everywhere. But yet there also has to be some other way to think about this. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find a way to be honest about my debts, my gratitudes, my formation, and then also see if I can't help shift the conversation just a little bit and inflect it just a little bit differently. And what I'm suggesting is that instead of trying to, kill the father, which would be too Oedipal and just replaces it, instead of pretending that it doesn't have any effect or importance, which I think is a little bit naive, I'm saying, what if we mourn our fathers, for their flaws and their positive elements, and use that mourning? And this is where Noelle Vahanian's work is so crucial to me. She's a fellow graduate student of mine at Syracuse, daughter of Gabrielle Vahanian, who's the original Death of God theologian. And in her book, she's talking about this kind of like originary narcissism, primary narcissism, as a way of like undermining who we are and knowing who we are. And if we don't know who we are, then there's the possibility of being otherwise. And her work and her thought there, which is so powerful, just kind of becomes a hinge for me to then reflect and open and think about books like Bracha, Edinger, Kathryn Keller, Katerina Kolozova, as well as, of course, Malibu and Karen Barad. And so it became for me a way to say, I have something more to say about Derrida that's personal, because part of my relationship with him is personal. And as you said, that personal, I think, tone comes through in the rest of the book, but then here I can be more explicit. And it's confessional in a way. Derrida talks, it's confessional. And it scared me. It scared the crap out of me to write something like that and to publish something like that. And you mentioned the Joy Division, which was kind of like the first time I tried to be a little bit more personal in my writing. But this was, this seemed really, like really kind of intense in terms of just existentially. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it's in academic publishing, you don't get a lot of personalism. You don't get the personal stories. So I could see why that would be frightening as hell.
Well, Derrida is a good place to kind of loosen your tongue, right? As Caputo has said.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was also making the connection between this idea of the father and your notion of politics without or political theology without sovereignty. I think like a father figure, or in terms of like a sovereign figure for Schmitt, the sovereign is the one who determines the exception, right? So you have like that one kind of lordly kind of sovereign figure who determines the exception, but a political theology without sovereignty wants to do away with that. So I'm wondering if you can explicate or elaborate a little bit what political theology without sovereignty would look like.
Right. So in 2011, I published a book called Radical Political Theology, and the subtitle is Religion and Politics Without Liberalism. And Jeff Robbins, my comrade in arms, published a book on radical democracy and political theology. And so both of us kind of took the idea that we wanted to engage Schmitt, we wanted to critique Schmitt, but we didn't want Schmitt's definition or understanding of political theology to be the only one. And there are a lot of readers, there are a lot of folks, and I mentioned, I think quoted Negri at one point, says, there's one political theology, and that's the one that Schmitt wrote, or it goes from Jean Baudin and to Carl Schmitt. That's it. And it is about sovereignty and the sovereign exception. And so for a lot of folks, you can't have a political theology except in terms of sovereignty and convenient sense. And so what I'm trying to do is say, there's got to be another possibility, whether you call it political theology or not. And so in the Radical Political Theology book, I'm not as clear about this, but I'm trying to bring the discourse of radical theology that I came up in with these conversations of political theology. I'm trying to bring those together and see what happens if they kind of intersect, and see what it shows us and tells us about what's going on in the world today. Because for the most part, political theology in theology has been about even if it's about limiting God's sovereignty, it's gone on in just in very sort of traditional theological conversations. Mm-hmm. But then the philosophical discourse of political theology, which, you know, goes back to Schmidt, but really got revived with Agamben, you know, and then Esposito's doing great stuff, and then, you know, like there's so much that's really rich, and then De Vries and Sullivan edited this big, you know, huge, enormous book with Fordham on political theologies, and, you know, just all this rich and important and significant stuff. And so then it becomes a question of how is it that religion and politics can't be separated today? Mm-hmm. And there's almost this fantasy that we could strictly demarcate the religious from the secular. And so that the secular sphere was about, you know, civil practices, civil politics, and public reasons and rationality, and religion was a private matter of faith. That was kind of this fantasy of European modernity and what I call secularism. So modern secularism goes hand in hand with modern liberalism. And I go back to Locke for some of this, although we can go earlier with, you know, Luther and some other stuff. But this modern secularism is what's breaking down, or what comes to break down. I mean, it never worked in practice, but there was this imagination among many intellectuals and philosophers that it could or should work. And what happens at the end of the 20th century or late 20th century is what Jose Casanova calls the deprivatization of religion. Religion becomes deprivatized and comes back into the public sphere, which it never left, but in a way that it can't be ignored anymore. Mm-hmm. And this is part of what, you know, fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, Islamic neo-fundamentalisms, Hindu, you know, Hindutva, right, with in India, Jewish or Israeli fundamentalism, Zionisms, all these. I mean, and no religion is sort of safe from that, but it indicates something, not the post-secular, this is the radical Orthodox story, the post-secular triumph of religion or return to religion after we've dispensed with secular and secularity, but that those two things can't be sort of separated or teased apart. I mean, the opposition between the religious and the secular deconstructs in Derridian terms, and so you have to attend to those interactions, intersections, entanglements. You have to like deal with that. And one of the things that it shows is that it shows a breakdown of modern liberalism, because modern liberalism has devolved into this kind of what we call politically liberal today on the left, which is a lot of times a term of abuse, or at best it's like these, you know, kind and nice sentiments, but it's undergirded by this brutal economic neoliberalism. So it's like we say, well, we care about everybody and we accept them and tolerance and multiculturalism, but the economy is just crushing people everywhere. And then on the right, you know, you've got these people that see the problems with, like Schmidt, see the problems with liberalism, see all the difficulties, and then they become conservatives, or they become neoconservatives, or they become realists, or, you know, whatever. But that's, to me, that's not a possible, like, viable choice, because I can't be a conservative, I can't be a traditionalist, I can't be on the right in any way. And so then what about the radical alternative, which isn't simply dogmatic Marxism, because we can't, that's naive and doesn't seem viable, but a kind of post-Marxist Marx, which you see in Spectres of Marx. You see this with Negri's Marx Beyond Marx. You see all these other kind of things kind of emerging, and it brings back, you know, Zizek helps with some of this stuff, but brings back attention and an understanding and what used to be called political economy. And so we have to think about political economy if we're going to think about religion and politics, but even beyond political economy, we have to think about a political ecology, because we have to situate this in a world and a planet where we're running up against the physical limits of natural resources. And the capitalist fantasy, the capitalist religion is growth can continue indefinitely, if not infinitely. That's how that's the capitalist faith. Mm-hmm. But when you reach a limit or limits to growth, capitalism morphs into something that Naomi Klein calls savage capitalism, disaster capitalism. It becomes something really, really virulent and terrible. It's not that it's good before that, but it gets really more intense. And then things start to sort of implode and tear apart. And I think we have to come to terms with that in a physical sense, not just a metaphysical sense, in terms of global warming, in terms of resource depletion, in terms of the vital issues of our world, which is one of the reasons why I turned to new materialism.
You mentioned liberalism and secularism, and it makes me kind of think about the West, writ large. And this made me think, you draw out conversation between Derrida and Jean-Luc Nancy in this work, as well as in your previous one on radical political theology, in a way that brings some of those different themes together: Christianity, deconstruction in the West, and you mentioned capitalism, right? I think we can easily add that to the matrix there. But like this question that you write about of whether any possible overcoming of that matrix, which I think we all are sort of like thinking towards, can be anything but a victory by it. For me, that question is really provocative, and I found myself just sitting with it a lot lately. I don't really have the answer, but I don't know. This is the point where I start to wonder, following that logic, can we move past it? Is transformation even possible? And I'm thinking about your engagement with Malibu. Even if it appears to have happened, doesn't it just sort of like double back onto itself in this sort of infinite translatability that you refer to? How can Derrida and an engagement with Derrida and Malibu help us overcome that, or think our way out of this? I don't know. I guess it's like a double bind, maybe.
Yeah. And I think they each give us different ways or resources to try to do that. Well, I think Derrida would be more attuned to how difficult, if not impossible, that such a thing is. So if we're thinking about Christianity and capitalism, okay, and I think that Gil Onajar's book, Blood, A Critique of Christianity, is a really important work here as well. And Schmidt's kind of in the background of his book, and he's also giving this, reading of Merchant of Venice, which is, found this essay by Derrida on Merchant of Venice, which I thought was really. So if we think about Christianity, and if we think about European modernity, after the Enlightenment, Protestant Reformation, Enlightenment, there was this sense of like European modernity as a break from what became before, which was a kind of Christian medievalism. And today, one of the things that postmodernism means is that we see much more continuities with that than we do discontinuities. So again, this notion of the West and the European West and tradition as a consolidation as a tradition. And so what Walter Benjamin says is kind of fascinating theses or writings or suggestions. He says, Max Weber's notion didn't go far enough in Christianity and the spirit of capitalism. He says, actually, Christianity became capitalism. Like completely transformed itself into capitalism. So what we call Christianity as actually existing Christianity is in some ways a subtraction from from Christianity becoming capitalism as being Christian, and that capitalist Christianity machine, that what William Connolly might call a resonance machine, although he's talking about evangelical Christianity, not, Christianity as such. It's that's what Lacan calls, the true religion. And he says, the triumph of religion is that it always wins. And Derrida's kind of saying, here's the problem. Any kind of, or Nancy trying to take it on and deconstruct it, all, raises the specter, at least the fear of a Christian victory in imperialist terms. And so you can't simply attack it, destroy it, get rid of it. And I think, many people have said the same thing about capitalism. As much as people have wanted to attack, destroy, deconstruct, subvert capitalism, it keeps working. And then at the level of our imagination, as a kind of impoverishment, Frederick Jameson says, and Zizek repeats, it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world than living in a world that's not organized by capitalism. So if capitalism and Christianity are linked, essentially, and that's what, I think a certain kind of Christianity is linked with capitalism, then the question is what can be done about it. And then there's certain resources in thought and in theory that I think Derrida give us, Malibu gives us, Deleuze and Guattari give us, and then others in different ways, right? Barad, Latour, other contemporary philosophers and thinkers. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm more pessimistic, but also more fatalistic, because I don't think that, I think capitalism is gonna fail because it's gonna fall in on itself. It's gonna collapse in on itself. But what it creates may well be worse. It probably will be worse, because there's probably going to be a catastrophe. But we can only imagine these apocalyptic catastrophes in our movies and our fantasies and our science fiction, and we project those. And that's not what's happening or what's going to happen necessarily. Not that those things don't happen and can't happen, but those are imaginary fantasies. What we have to do is really think about where and how capitalism is imploding, where and how, Naomi Klein talks about, this changes everything, capitalism against the climate. The scientists are telling us, not the activists, that we need to, revolt. The scientists are telling us we need to revolt. Nature's telling us something. And so there's, there's a sense of the symbolic and language as like so totalizing, and we have this constructivism, this linguistic, idealism, whatever caricature stuff in the middle 20th century. But one of the things that we see at the end of the century and the beginning of the 21st century is a kind of return of nature. And not that that's not necessarily a good thing, but what does it show us, or what does it tell us, or what does it give us about how we can think about all these things without simply rejecting Derrida, Lacan, Deleuze as these, post-structuralists that we don't take seriously anymore. So that's kind of what I'm trying to work through and think through.
That seems to get into your work on object-oriented ontology, perhaps as another means of helping us to think, as you've written, from the earth. I don't want to assume that people know what that is. It's kind of a mouthful, right?
Yeah.
So could you just give us like a real brief sense of what is object-oriented ontology? Why does it matter? And what difference might it make for kind of reorienting ourselves in a way that allows for a more ethical relation to the earth or something like that?
Yeah. So in the early 2000s, there's this movement in Britain called speculative realism. And Graham Harman is the person most associated with that. Although there's others in the United States like Levi Bryant who've written about this. So, and Quentin Meillassoux, who is kind of a student of Badiou, is also associated with this book. So he publishes this book after Finitude. It's this critique of correlationism. He says, ever since Kant, we think that we have to correlate objects with subjects, and that this institutes a kind of subjectivism, and that even postmodernism is this extreme subjectivism. And what we need to do is we need to transform our orientation of thinking that we have to correlate the objects that we see or have or posit with our subjectivity, and think and shift to the vantage point of the objects themselves, sort of the things themselves. So there's a little bit of a tension with what Deleuze and what Whitehead before him call processes. Objects and processes are sometimes very different things, and sometimes they're similar things. It seems like a little bit of a naive, but a very sort of strong move to try to overcome some of the subjectivism that has animated a lot of our continental philosophies. And so that's where we have the object-oriented ontology, the kind of a flat ontology where everything is like everything else. There's a thought, there's a book, there's a brick, there's a social practice. They're all on the same sort of plane of eminence. Deleuze is kind of invoked more positively than most of the others because Deleuze was never seen as a linguistic idealist. And so we need to think about, objects and about and from and these strange objects. And then Tim Morton, so he writes this book, Hyperobjects, that I really like. It's really a good, fascinating, interesting book. And Morton's actually more affirmative of Derrida than others of these folks are. I appreciate that. But what he calls a hyperobject is like this immense, massive object, or, and again, here's another word, right? System, right? We think of systems in terms of systems theory from the 20th century. And one of the things it means is that instead of the language for philosophy being primarily driven from or taken from the social sciences in the middle of the century, of the 20th century, now there is this kind of return to the natural sciences. So again, physics, biology, even chemistry, mathematics, certainly with Badiou and Meillassoux. And so we need to return to the natural sciences. We need to take these seriously. We need to undermine the oppositions or splits between what we think of as our social world and the world of nature. And Bruno Latour helps us do that. And so there's all this interest in objects, but sometimes it becomes naive, it becomes sort of overdone, it becomes depoliticized. And I think that Derrida and Lacan have already said really interesting things. Derrida not explicitly, but Lacan explicitly about what he calls the object petit a. And Derrida is nothing if not, he was very critical of Lacan, but he was a very subtle reader of Lacan. And I try to, sort of pull that out. And so this notion of an object is this strange object that sort of is imaginary, but also captures something of the real in it. And it's not like we can simply just get ourselves out of what Lacan calls the symbolic, the law, all these social practices, structures, and things that shape who we are and what we know and what we think. But that doesn't mean that encompasses or covers everything, because there's still a lot more. And even when Lacan talks about the object in one of his seminars, Seminar 17, he talks about entropy and he talks about energy transformation, and he's analyzing this in a really interestingly materialistic way, even though I don't think Lacan or Derrida would use the language or the term materialism. But when we think about neo-materialism or new materials, it provides a really interesting way to go back and read Derrida, Lacan, and others. And of course, Deleuze is a very strong, influence and inspire on that. So I'm trying to take some of the interesting stuff that the object-oriented ontologies and the focus on objects and strange objects and hyperobjects by some of these folks like Harman and Bryant and Morton, but try to bring that back into my reading of Derrida, and also sort of not say that that's not quite enough, or that's not quite it. So anyway, Derrida talks, I return to Derrida's critique of Heidegger's theses on world and from the fundamental concepts of metaphysics, where he says the human or the Dasein is, world building, creates worlds. The animal is poor in world. And Derrida, obviously, we've written a lot about the animal. There's a lot of animal studies looking at that. I mentioned that, but I don't really go into it. And then for Heidegger, the stone is without world. And so Derrida notes that. Derrida says in a couple of places, nothing seems to be more problematic than these theses, but Derrida himself doesn't consider what it means for a stone to be without world, even though Derrida problematizes the Heideggerian notion of world, and so does Morton. And so I'm like, well, what if a stone is without world, but so is an animal, and so is a human? And then what if it's not just an object, like an inanimate object isn't just a stone? What if it's a subatomic particle? What if it's a quantum field theory? And then what kind of crazy stuff happens? And I think that Karen Barad's work and Karen Barad's book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, is probably the most important book written about science for non-scientists so far this century. It's had a huge impact. And I don't know, scientists or physicists or quantum, they probably don't, take her seriously because of the language that she uses, although she has a PhD in physics, theoretical physics, but I don't know if she's taken serious by science, but non-scientists are absolutely riveted by this work and this book. And it's incredibly important. And she's using Derrida to explain and talk about what's going on at the level of this quantum field theory, especially in terms of this ontology or ontological materialism. And I think that's really significant.
Yeah. That being without a world.
Yeah.
That seems to kind of tie back to what we were talking about earlier with how Derrida is trying to, offer an alternative conception of sovereignty, or at least in your reading. Mm-hmm. And then you have this, you don't linger on it too long, but you talk about the sovereignty of death. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if these two things are related to you, and how those two things might be related. And it seems to kind of all tie back to ethics in a way, but mm-hmm. I'm not sure how to kind of articulate that.
Yeah, it's really, there's so much there, but Derrida at the end of The Beast and the Sovereign ends up with Heidegger, as he always does, reflecting on Heidegger's claim that death is the ultimate sovereign, but death as the sovereign also is what completely destroys every other locus of sovereignty or claim of sovereignty. It relativizes it, destroys it, undermines. And so Derrida says, in Rams, he says this other places too, so every death is the end of the world. Not the end of a world, but the end of the world. And so then once somebody dies and it's the end of the world, you're kind of mourning and the world falls away. And that's where he has this Celan poem, this quote from this great poem by Celan. It says, "The world is gone, I must carry you." And so that carrying or bearing, the German tragen, is how that ethical relationship emerges or continues at the end of the world, where the world has disappeared or withdrawn, but there's still the I and the you, which is, it's Levinasian, but it's not that there's just me and you, because there's always another. Even if it's your death, even if I'm mourning my relationship with you, even if I'm, your infinite demand on my subjectivity, my moral responsibility, my personality is absolutely there and absolutely infinite. There's always others, and there's always others, and this becomes multiple and again, infinite in a different way in terms of a series. And so I think that, just as we have so many beings, human beings on the planet, we also have so much death. And the 20th century is this century of death that Badiou calls the passion for the real, but the organized mass murder and putting to death of people at the same time as this biopolitical organization and control of people's lives. And so, of course, life and death aren't opposites, but we need to think about death and life and death, even as we face at its limit the possibility of the extinction of human beings on this planet due to, anthropogenic climate change. We need to think about that. We need to confront that, as well as the extinction of all these species, the sixth great extinction in the history of the planet. And I think for me, sovereignty, right? The fantasy of sovereignty is to think that we get to decide what happens, like as a species, or as a, as white men, or as, whatever the great, the United States as the world superpower, or whatever, CEOs of the major corporations. So for me, if sovereignty is anything, it's multiple. And I think Derrida says it's multiple. I think Deleuze says this as well. And it's more like what Deleuze calls and what scientists, physicists call a singularity, as a kind of threshold transformation, where something, in a system bifurcates or transforms or changes. It reaches this, this point of chaotic complexity. And then there's like there's the resilience of a system, but then at one point, one small effect can have a huge difference. Mm-hmm. And it transforms the whole system, pushes it into a different state. It may be a better state or a worse state, and that's always relative to who's, evaluating the state, or what is wanted from it. But I think that if sovereignty is anything, we have to think more of a physical sovereignty along those lines as a kind of singularity of transformation, and then look for these singular points and moments that are never just one, because they can't be just one. For Derrida, they're never just one. And that's where, for me, it's like this is happening in what we call natural physical processes. Also happening in social processes, all political processes, economic. This is they're different thresholds, right? But there's some things that go across these thresholds as well. Sorry, go ahead, Preston.
Oh yeah, I'm not sure how well this will fit into this notion or your notion of sovereignty, but it's Easter weekend, and I'm thinking of like death as the ultimate sovereign, and I'm thinking of tomorrow we're celebrating, or some people are celebrating this idea of like of a resurrection. Right, and I'm wondering if we could read the resurrection as what you're just talking about, as a singularity or as an insurrection, where it's a threshold that is crossed that disrupts the sovereign of whatever that sovereignty happens to be, a physical sovereignty of death, or a political sovereignty of Rome, or any kind of like imperial power, or a social sovereignty of meaninglessness, I suppose, or that would be more of a personal sovereignty. So I'm wondering how you may or may not be able to incorporate like a resurrection, and however we're understanding that bodily or metaphorically, into the system of death as the ultimate sovereign.
Yeah, so Derrida says resurrection means more life, perhaps, and Caputo goes along with that, and I think that's good. And I don't subscribe to or want anything to do with a literal resurrection, but and in our Insurrectionist manifesto that I did with Robbins, Vahanian, and Ward Blanton, we tried to shift that talk of resurrection more towards that insurrection. And you're right, Jesus or the Jesus movement or whatever is seen as a threat to Rome, seen as an attack or a subversion of that sovereign power, and that's how he's put to death as a criminal. And what that means for anyone, anywhere, that opposes power, unjust power, and then is killed or disappeared or whatever. We have to think about those all of those things. And then, of course, Kathryn Kellner afterward took us to task a little bit, because she said, we need some kind of, resurrection still. And it doesn't have to be, again, it's not an opposition between insurrection and resurrection, because at some point that deconstructs. But I'd rather, with Caputo, be clear that we're not talking about a magic fairy tale here, where somebody's dead and then they get brought back to life. It's a magic trick. Like, that's a gimmick. That's not real. But life is real, and the idea, the possibility of more life, of having a death sentence and then having that suspended, like Derrida having pancreatic cancer, or anyone that has cancer, or anyone that has a life-threatening illness. I mean, we're all sentenced to death, but sometimes we feel like we have reprieves because we feel like there's more that we have to do, and more that we can do, and more that we get. And even if we do die, we do die, but when we do die, there's still the possibility of our work. That's one of the reasons why we write books, right? But other things, our relationships, live on in a sense,
right.
And others, as long as there are others to possess that or experience.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that notion, going back to the notion of mourning and carrying them, the Trogan notion, because it seems to me that like finitude and death opens up the possibility for friendships and intimate relationships, in a sense, because we know that or a different quality, a different richness to our friendships, because we know that they're finite. We know we're finite, right? We know that things are not going to continue on for us in the same way they're continuing on now. So the worlds, the multiplicity of worlds that we have now will end. Right. And human beings and all sentient life forms perhaps will end eventually in this universe. When we're talking about dark matter and dark energy kind of expanding and blowing things apart. Right. So ultimately, it seems to me that the end of this cosmos is a final end. There's no more sentient life. And so even this notion of carrying with you will end too. But still, it brings about a particular richness within our conversations with each other and our friendships with each other, because we know that they're not going to end. And I like Peter Rollins' critique of the resurrection. He talks about how he doesn't do not resuscitate. Like we don't need more of the same in a resurrection. We need something brand new. We need something. So that's why I like this notion of insurrection, because it's a kind of it's a newness. It's a novel form of a political kind of insurrection, or a social insurrection, or a religious insurrection. And of course, with your work, we can't really separate the religious and the political and the social. They're all entangled with each other, right? So and even in the Insurrections Manifesto, I mentioned, it's so interesting how when Preston asked me if we could do a book series together, right? Because he would bring Zizek and I would participate in this, and then we tried to find a place, and then I reached out to Jeff because I was already doing something with Jeff, and then like worked out with Columbia to do this book series. And then we said, well, what are we going to name it? What are we going to call it? And so we're playing things around, and Jeff finally came up with Insurrections. We said, we like this. We sent this to Columbia,
the Columbia marketing people came back and said, we can't market this, choose another name. And we said no. And we basically said, Slavoj Žižek wants Insurrections. Are you going to tell him no? And so they backed down, right? That's why we have Žižek on the series with us, right? To give us some thought. Yeah. And so it becomes this series, Insurrections, Critical Studies in Religion, Politics, and Culture. And we publish these books in them. And then Rollins is reading this stuff. He's reading Žižek, he's reading our work, and he writes a book called Insurrection, right? And then does this kind of insurrection thing. And then we finally say, well, okay, we need to write something to spell out what we mean by insurrectionist theology. That was the manifesto.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's interesting how those things go back and forth sometimes. But and the other thing is, I think sometimes as academics, as intellectuals, as philosophers of religion, there's a real solitariness to that. There's a real sense of you're doing things on your own and it's all, just you as a solitary ego. And that's not very interesting or fun for me. So I love doing things more collaborative because it's more exciting, it's more satisfying, it's richer. And I don't want, I don't need the credit for having done whatever. But if something I've done can spark, an idea in somebody else, and then they can take it and do something else creative with it, that's kind of cool for me. More than the idea of me being, sort of honored as having done whatever, which I think is in some ways useless and pointless, right? Kind of vanity. So, yeah.
Well, it looks like you're developing a little bit of I hate that echo. Do you guys hear that?
Oh yeah,
making me crazy.
Just a teeny bit. But,
developing your own little community. I saw the pictures out in when you're in Cali.
Mm-hmm.
That's a scary group you put together.
That's fun. Well, it's really because they started this God seminar on God and the Human Future at Westar as a way to kind of deal with some of the historical impasses that they run into with the Jesus seminar. What happens once with historical scholarship, what happens if you figure out, okay, this is what happened or might have happened or what we can know about the early, Christianity, but there's still these issues and questions. And so this guy, David Galston, starts his God seminar and he invites Jack Caputo to come and engage with him. And so then Jack's invite Clayton and Jeff to come and respond. And I couldn't go because this was 3-4 years ago, but I had a family trip. And so Jeff went, and then Jeff called me and said, this is so exciting. This is really a great opportunity. But most of the people that were there were holdovers from the other seminars, and they didn't understand the philosophy and the theology that was going on. And so one of the things we try to do is okay, let's open this up. Let's bring new people in and let's see what we can do. And so Jeff ended up taking over the role of the director of that seminar, even as Galston ended up being the executive director of Westar overall. And they've got the Christianity seminar. But as the more we've gone on, the more I'm convinced that the Jesus seminar absolutely needs the God seminar, because we need to ask those kinds of questions, even if the criteria for evidence in evaluation and voting or whatever it can't be the same, based on historical event, what's our historical knowledge versus what can we know or think about God. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to clear away the conventional, traditional theistic God and open up some varieties of theism. And that's going to be a book that comes out of the God seminar in a few years. But before that, right now, we did a seminar, we did a session in Boston on a critical report on Christian nationalism. And so Wipfenstock Cascade is going to publish that, hopefully by the end of the year. So we're going to call it Doing Theology in the Age of Trump, Critical Report on Christian Nationalism.
I was there in Boston.
Yeah.
And that voting was a little bit weird. Throw your marbles in here if you think one thing.
Very strange.
Yeah. But I know you said you have to get going, but I just wanted to make a sort of a remark about this book that I really deeply enjoyed. You're performing through your writing the philosophy that you're trying to point toward. This is where the constructive aspects really came to full fruition in the last chapter with Barad, with the idea of diffraction and putting that in proximity with Derridian difference and Deleuzian difference and this metaphor of the waves. You kind of pick up on something Deleuze writes, and you write, something passes between the borders, events explode, phenomena flash like thunder and lightning. the energy of the book really came together at the end there. It was a real nice climax. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much. I'm glad that came through. And like I said, I really tried to do that. I was I was relatively pleased with how it ended up. And I thought Fordham did a great job. And I like to cover a lot too. I tried to do something like that with my book on Deleuze, called Deleuze Beyond Badiou. But I don't think I quite, I was sort of stretching to try to give an interpretation of and understand Deleuze that I'd gotten to, but I don't feel like I was sort of personally could do with that the same thing that I was able to write off of. Great to talk to you guys, and great. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.
See you guys. Yeah, bye.
Preston, you want to hang out for a sec?
Yeah, we can do that.
All right. So?
That was fun. Really intense, though.
It was a little bit
so much theory there. He's just so bright,
I know.
He's read so much,
Yeah, he was, in the first half of that interview, he was just kind of throwing a lot of names around.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, I'm not following all that, but
yeah,
good for you. Good for you that you know all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that was fun though. I really enjoyed it. But I like Clayton's approach, because if we had a question about, what does this mean? What does triple O mean and stuff like that, or how can you define it? He would do the teacher thing. He would just take it and break it down in simple terms and clearly communicate what it was he was trying to say, and it would come across just fine. And then I'd be like, okay, I got it. I'm there with you. Like when he gave a little bit of background on triple O, and he started with speculative realism and the thinkers there, and then he moved into this kind of like Quentin Mayhew's notion of, or critique of correlationalism and stuff like that. I'm like, that's helpful. That's like reading a book from Clayton Crockett on triple on speculative realism.
Did you think his description of that was clear? I sort of got lost in my own thoughts when he was, even though it was my question, I sort of got lost in my own thoughts.
No, yeah, I thought so. I thought it came across pretty clearly. I think one thing he didn't talk about, though, I think he could have made a connection, or he could have either critiqued it or made a stronger connection of like whether or not it was a success or a failure, or like what were the strong points. Like, can we actually get? I mean, in the book, he does a good job of critiquing it by saying we don't need to get rid of subjectivity, and maybe that's where the critiques of correlationalism.
Yeah, because I had that question too, and there was some. I'm not going to look for where it is now, but. And I think this kind of like connects to how, how Deleuze sort of writes about how, he's anti-consciousness and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Do you think those two things are related?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, but although in process thinking with Whitehead, maybe not so much, because Whitehead wants to say every kind of like from every level there's a subjectivity, and even when we get down to like matter and stuff like that, I don't think he would argue that matter is conscious, but it has a subjectivity. So maybe, I guess it depends on your metaphysic, right? Like, I usually think of subjectivity and consciousness as being together, like they're one and the same idea, or like similar.
But it's sort of like trying to like imagine yourself in the shower, but you're not in the shower or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to displace yourself like that. I guess that's what phantasaical thinking, not just is about. Like we can imagine ourselves in places we're not, but that would be a part of a subject of being a subject, right? Like because we can do that. I don't think an electron can imagine itself to be in a place that it's not, or I don't think a rock, a stone can imagine a life otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that's
I think he writes at some point somewhere in here along the lines of like we can't get rid of consciousness, and to me that means in a way we can't get rid of to some extent the subject object distinction. We can't kind of just theorize our way past it. We need to kind of work with it.
Yeah, and I guess I would couple that with this idea of like with the father. You can't really kill the father. You just need to mourn the father, or mourn the loss of the father, rather than try to kind of completely get rid of it. So we can't get rid of consciousness. We might have to, but we might need to like mourn the problems with the subject object split.
Yeah, no, I think there's something to that. Especially, and like thinking about, we didn't talk about it a lot, but there's that chapter about surviving Christianity.
Yeah.
He's like, listen, we can't move. There's no getting past it. In fact, the attempt to move past Christianity is itself a Christian victory. It's that Jean-Luc Nancy question. So he's like, we just have to mourn it.
Yeah. Which is weird, because would that be mourning? Because in the Freudian sense, I think mourning, there's actually a loss, but it's melancholy if the thing is still around, but we're still kind of like, we don't have it, right? So I wonder if maybe it would be more of a melancholic notion, because Christianity is still around, but like we don't want it, or we don't have it in the same way. Mm-hmm. I guess I don't know. I mean,
and we can't get it back. It really is sort of Christianity is a lost object. Maybe that's, in a way, that's kind of the whole sort of edifice on which it's built. Right? I mean, that's what Pete
I was thinking
is getting at in his work with the Divine Magician and all that stuff, like drawing on the con. I don't know.
No, I agree. I actually agree with that. That's exactly who I was thinking about when you mentioned that. Like, Christianity became, in Clayton's word, capitalism. Mm-hmm. And so we lost Christianity, or maybe Christianity has always been, like in Pete's way, always been about the lost object that you can never actually get. Right. So to me, it's an object that was never lost, because it's an object that never was, right?
Exactly.
Isn't that the point? It's not that we lost the object, it's that we lost the fantasy, and the fantasy was the object.
Right. The lost object is like kind of the phantasmatic coordinate.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like just, mourning is so mourning for me is sort of a way of letting go of that and becoming maybe indifferent. Do you have to get going?
No, she's just doing something. I don't know what she's doing.
Okay.
I was just looking, see what she's up to. I think I agree with you. I think that the master signifier, this transcendental signifier, the kind of the big other that makes sense of the world. Mm-hmm. I think in that sense, like I don't think that ever existed. So I think that it's a notion that we are projecting onto the world. And so Christianity and Pete's work is like ridding ourselves of that notion, like when the temple curtain is split and there's nothing in the temple, which is supposed to be the whole this is a problematic I had with that thinking, because the glory shouldn't be in there in the first place. It should be in Jesus, so it's already not in the temple, And then also you can read it like second temple, like maybe God never came back to the second temple because it was never his institution, right? So,
well, I mean, it depends on how if your reading is like more Christian or more Jewish, right? I guess.
Right. Good point. Yeah. But this idea, like, if the big other was never there, we didn't lose it. We kind of lost the fantasy, which is actually, it's hard. It can be helpful to go through that, like through his, like, I think Pete's doing like more of a therapeutics. He's doing more of like a theotherapeutics these days.
Dude. Yeah, here it is. This guy on like a Pete fan page or whatever. It's not a Pete fan page. It's what is pyrotheology? Oh, you're part of that, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Let's see. I think the story about snakes and Moses is especially relevant to recent discussions about pyro and deconstruction. The snakes were biting the people, which is a manifestation of their complaining against God. Moses raises up a center to dispel the chaos of the complaining snakes, right? The phallus, right? The center is a snake on a pole. That's me. In light of this, maybe pyro is the same sort of thing. Let's say for simplicity's sake that doubt is what led most people to pyrotheology. When you are by yourself, doubt can be chaotic and destructive. I know it was for me. Then Pete raises doubt up on a pole and says, this is the new center. In that act, there is a new unity created and a new center established. This enables the doubt to be a unifying force and not a chaotic force. Like, I get it, but like, I just think it's wrong.
I think it's wrong too, but if we're using the metaphor of snakes, and this might be a little bit racist, but maybe Pete's St. Patrick is getting rid of all the snakes out of Ireland kind of thing. Or the Pied Piper where he's like, taking all the rats out of the city kind of thing.
he's got kind of like a skipping through the streets sort of vibe.
I just think it might be racist because there's a whole correlation between St. Patrick and Ireland and all that. Even though Patrick wasn't Irish, I think it was British, but
right.
So it might be colonial.
Yeah, I'm sure
he's going
it is.
to Ireland to take out all the snakes, but
I'm sure we're terrible people.
Yeah. We should mourn the loss of our humanity.
We should. Okay.
Take this time.
And like, actually, as we were talking just now, I thought some of our off-the-cuff reflections were interesting too. Maybe I'll just leave some of that stuff in. What do you think?
Here at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, just the stuff, not the St. Patrick stuff, but the other stuff.
Are you sure?
I don't care. Whatever. As long as send it to Pete, see if he thinks it's bad.
I'll do an edit and then I'll send it to you and you can tell me what you think.
Cool. All right, man.
All right, man. Have a good day.
Thanks. You too. See ya.